sexual conflict can lead to adaptations within each sex that help each sex to get a leg up in the interaction between them. And yet another interesting implication is that those male adaptations and female adaptations can co-evolve with each other. And so that means that sexual conflict can be a source of rapid evolution, diversification, both phenotypic and looking across taxa, in a co-evolutionary battle of the sexes. So in recent years, there's been lots of really excellent work on sexual conflict, and we've got lots of really interesting insights. And yet we still have many fundamental questions about the basics of this evolutionary process. And so these questions are what my lab aims to find the answers to. And so one of the questions is about the reach of sexual conflict in shaping diverse kinds of adaptations in animal life. So we know quite a bit about conflict over mating interactions, like the kind we've just seen in water striders. But we should expect conflict between males and females to occur over all kinds of traits, lots of different ways that the sexes interact. So things like parental care, foraging adaptations, which is something my lab's working on that I won't have time to talk about today. And we also don't know the reach of sexual conflict in shaping the genome. So the kind of loci that contribute to male and female traits involved in conflict, how those loci evolve and co-evolve with each other. And another big unanswered question is the extent to which the ecological setting matters for sexual conflict and how sexual arms races proceed. I'll say more about that question in a little bit. So I think these questions are interesting, both from a basic fundamental science perspective and also from an applied perspective. So, you know, evolutionary conflict and sexual conflict is a fundamental evolutionary phenomenon. And so understanding it helps us to understand adaptation and diversity in the world around us. It can also help us understand differences between males and females and sexual dimorphism. One of the major sources of phenotypic diversity. And there's also the potential for applied contributions. So learning about co-evolutionary arms races between males and females could inform our understanding of other kinds of arms races that are important to us, such as arms races between ourselves and our pathogens, or you know, the pathogens of organisms that we depend on. So my lab is focused on sexual conflict and its impact on different diverse aspects of animal life. So we look at behavior, life history, nutrition. We are looking at molecular phenotypes. We have some metabolomics work in progress. I'll talk later about some upcoming work on the genomics of sexual conflict. And then we also work on related topics like sexual selection and signal evolution too. So that's kind of the big picture. And then what I want to talk to you about today is three things. One is about a recent direction in my lab looking at conflict within a sex and focusing on the evolution and expression of aggressive behavior within one sex. So for example, males in lots of species face competition over access to females. And we've been looking at how that kind of conflict plays out in fruit flies and beyond fruit flies as well. I then want to tell you about some work on the ecology of sexual conflict in water striders, and then tell you about some upcoming work in water striders that builds on that work. Okay, so starting off with aggressive behavior in fruit flies. So looking across the animal kingdom, aggressive behavioral displays are some of the most dramatic behaviors that we can see in the natural world. And in recent years, we've had increasing understanding from some key model species of some of the mechanics of aggression, the physiology of aggression, really exciting work on the genetics of aggression. And yet there's lots of open questions that remain, especially about the relationship between aggression and the environment. So some of the questions that we're looking at are how sensitive the expression of aggression is to environmental variation, and to what extent animals can take in information about the abiotic social environment and use that information to fine-tune how aggressive they are. So there's that kind of plasticity. And then we're also interested in how plasticity interacts with the evolution of aggression in response to the local environment, and whether if there's enough plasticity, if that might inhibit behavioral evolution in response to the environment. And then I'll tell you about another study where we're looking at how patterns of microevolution might scale up into macroevolutionary patterns of variation among species and aggression, and how that relates to the environment. So we studied the first two of these questions in fruit flies. And there's lots of advantages to working with fruit flies for studies of aggressive behavior. They're really tractable, got really good control in the lab, generate lots and lots of samples. And then they also have lots of underlying physiology and the genetics of their behavior, which is shared with other organisms, including humans. So there's good potential for translational value. So I'll start off telling you about some of this work in fruit flies. And the first thing to say is that fruit flies display aggressive behavior. So I hope you can see this video now. Here we have two male fruit flies in an arena in the lab. They're marked with a dot of paint on their thorax. And there's a food disc in the middle that is really important to them. So they're using their forelegs to bat at each other. They're lunging at each other, thrusting their bodies at each other. And they're fighting over control of that food disc, which is important to them because it's important to females. So if there was a female around, she'd be attracted to that food disc. Males also use threats towards each other. They use a wing threat behavior. So here's two males, instead of fighting, they're waving their wings at each other in a way that's an aggressive threat display instead of an outright fight. So we know that aggression benefits males, helps them gain access to female mates, and that's really important for their fitness. But we also know that aggressive displays can be costly. And so theory tells us that males should adjust their expression of aggression in response to the environment. And so in fact, we have evidence for that kind of plasticity. So some recent studies we've done show that flies are paying attention to several aspects of the environment and adjusting their aggression. So they're sensitive to the nutritional environment that they experience. So this is work from my PhD student, Danny Edmunds, and colleague Stu Wigby. And so what Danny showed is that the effects of nutrition on aggression depend on the life stage when variation in nutrition is experienced. So if flies experience good nutrition early in life, early in development, during the larval stage, then they are more aggressive as adults. So this is what we have here. We have the developmental diet and the quality of that diet on the x-axis, and then the probability that males lunged at each other in a controlled assay as adults. So you can see that males that grew up on good quality food were more aggressive adults. So, but interestingly, that's just the opposite of the effect of diet experienced at the adult stage. So this is another study where Danny manipulated the duration of food deprivation for males as adults. And here we have the probability of another aggressive behavior, fencing, on the y-axis. So here what we can see is that the longer males went without food, the more aggressive they got more aggressive behavior they displayed. So we have these contrasting effects of nutrition when experienced at different life stages. So flies are paying attention to their nutritional environment, and our earlier work showed that they are also paying attention to their social environment. And so this figure is showing that when male flies are interacting with their brothers who are related to them, they are showing reduced aggression compared to when males are interacting with unrelated other males. This is their overall rate of aggression. So flies are acting as if they understand social evolution theory, and they are down-regulating their aggressive behavior when interacting with kin. So overall, what we have here is, a number of different ways that flies are modulating their aggression in response to their environment. So we next wondered about changes in aggression over evolutionary time, and whether that kind of plasticity would constrain or limit adaptive responses over evolutionary time to the social environment. So here we looked at how aggression evolves in response to the degree of local competition. And here we looked at aggression in both males and females. This is a collaboration with Danny and Stu, as well as Ellie and Wayne and Tracy, all in the UK. So first thing to say is that just like male flies, female flies display aggressive behavior. So their signature move is a headbutt, which is what we could see there. I know that video is super fast, so I'm going to slow it down and play that again. So here's females fighting over access to that patch of food. One female is dominating the other and using headbutts to force the other female out. So an advantage to working with fruit flies is the short generation time, which means that we can manipulate the environment, allow flies to evolve in different environments for many generations, and then look at how phenotypes diverged in response. And so here we manipulated the degree of competition that males and females face by manipulating the population sex ratio. So we evolved populations of fruit flies under these 3 sex ratios. We've got female biased, where there's more competition among females for spots to lay eggs and for food. Equal sex ratio. Then we have male biased environments, where there's lots of competition among males for females. So we let flies evolve in these environments for 78 generations, and then assayed aggressive behavior in these controlled chambers. So we measured aggression in males and in females that had not mated and females that had mated. And we did that because previous work shows that mated females are much more aggressive than unmated females. So we predict that stronger competition within each sex will lead to intensified aggressive behavior. And to put it in a nutshell, that's exactly what we found. So starting off here with females, we found that evolving in a female-biased environment led to more aggressive displays by females. So what we're seeing here is the number of headbutts that females displayed in the 3 different sex ratios, whether they were virgin females or mated females. So the pattern that has emerged is that we see differences across the sex ratios in mated females only. There was no significant difference in aggression among the unmated females. It's only in mated females that we see elevated aggression in females that evolved in female-biased populations. So this result is interesting. Well, it's interesting to us in relation to our predictions, but also because there's been historically more of a focus on male aggression in studies of aggression, and some question about whether female aggression even evolves adaptively on its own or is simply a byproduct of selection for aggression in males. So this result is telling us that it's consistent with the idea that female aggression is an adaptation in females. Another thing I want to highlight about this result is that we're seeing the evolution of plasticity in aggression. So in these female biased populations, mating stimulated female aggression twice as much as it did in the other treatments. So there's both the evolution of aggression and also the evolution of plasticity in aggression in response to mating. If we look at males, competition had more subtle effects on male aggression. So we found no effect on the frequency of aggressive behaviors that males displayed. But instead what we found was that the location of aggression changed. So in these female biased populations, that's where males are experiencing reduced competition to gain access to females. That's when we see less of the aggression being performed on the food patch. So males were less inclined to aggressively defend food patches from other males. So overall, what we have from these studies is the sex-specific evolution of aggression in response to the social environment. There's plasticity in aggression, but that doesn't inhibit the evolution of aggression response to environmental variation. We can see that aggressive behavior can evolve rapidly, perhaps picking up an even stronger signal in females than in males. So now I'm going to switch gears a little bit and go beyond insects. And that's because we next wondered about whether these results within species were also apparent looking across species. And so we undertook a comparative study looking across species of vertebrates. This is a collaboration with Ellie and Jonathan and Joanne. So, it's clear that there's lots of variation in male and female aggression across species. And we wondered whether some of that variation could be explained by the things about the environment. And so here's two ideas about how that could happen and environmental variables that could be important. So one idea is that aggression is driven by sexual selection and the competition for mates. And if that's true, we should see more intense aggression when that competition for mates is strongest. So we should see variation in aggression depending on the mating system. And a second idea comes from social evolution theory. And it relates to that idea that individuals should be less aggressive towards their relatives. And whether individuals are interacting with their relatives depends on their dispersal, whether they've dispersed away from their natal group. Across species, sometimes it's males that do the dispersing, other times it's females. So here we can predict we should see more aggression in the sex that is dispersing more, relatively speaking. And it's probably true that neither of these things happens in isolation, so that we can expect interaction between things connected to sexual selection and the mating system and social behavior. So we're thinking about the environment here in terms of the social environment and interactions with other members of the same species. Okay, so we set out to test these hypotheses. We assembled a data set on aggression and dispersal from 107 vertebrates. So here's a figure illustrating some of that diversity in the data set. So what we can see is, most of the data comes from mammals, birds. So what we have here is this inner ring with pink and purple colors. That's about the mating system, going from monogamy, just one male, one female pairing together, all the way to promiscuity, where both sexes are mating with multiple mates. We have this middle ring, which is showing which sex disperses more, whether it's females dispersing more in yellow, males dispersing more in blue. And then we have this outer ring here showing which sex is observed to display more aggression for a species. So this is to illustrate that there's lots of variation across species in mating system, in sex-specific dispersal, and in aggressive behavior. But here's a summary of some of that variation. So this figure shows the ratio of observed male to female aggression. So here, this is a line where points above the line are species where males are the more aggressive sex or more frequently aggressive. Below the lines where species where females being more aggressive. So what we can see is that across this vertebrate data set, males are more frequently the aggressive sex. But we can also see that it's extremely variable among species. Lots of species are showing the opposite pattern. Well, it turns out that sex differences in dispersal explain some of this variation. So in this figure, I'll show whether it's males or females that are the more aggressive sex along the y-axis here, and showing that in response to the dispersal ratio. So as we go further to the right along this x-axis, males are dispersing further relative to females. So we already know that males are more likely to be the more aggressive sex. But when males disperse further than females, that's even more likely to be the case. And conversely, when females disperse further down here at the left end of that x-axis, that's where we see females tending to be the more aggressive sex. So that's consistent with that idea from social evolution theory. And furthermore, it turns out that dispersal interacts with the mating system around aggression. So in this system, we've got the 3 mating systems along the y-axis. And what we can see is that in these monogamous species here on the left, there is no significant effect of dispersal on which sex is more aggressive. And similarly, promiscuous species, no effect of dispersal. So it's only in these polygynous species where males are mating with multiple females. It's those species where we see this effect of dispersal kicking in on sex-specific aggressive behavior. So overall, this tells us that sexual selection theory and social evolution theory can successfully predict the occurrence of aggression, even across some really diverse species. And overall, what these studies tell us is that there's several axes of environmental variation that can all influence aggressive behavior: nutritional, social, and sexual. Those aspects of the environment all influencing aggression, and that we can pick up that signature within individuals when we look at plasticity and aggression. We can pick it up in microevolution across populations, and we can pick up that signature looking across species as well. Okay, so now coming back to sexual conflict and interactions between the sexes specifically. So I'd like to say more about water striders and our work in those insects. So first, to tell you more about the animals, these are bugs that spend their lives on the surface of freshwater bodies. They skate around all day, they're scavengers, and they look for stuff that's dead or nearly dead that they can help along on the surface of the water. And when they're sitting on the water, you know, they're not just passively sitting on that water surface, even when it looks like they're just standing still. Now, they're often displacing the surface of the water and creating ripple motions. And this is what we can see here. So here we have a male water strider up near the top of the video, in the middle, and then towards the lower left, a female water strider. And they are creating these surface vibrations. And those vibrations could represent signals that they are sending to each other. Here, the red coloration means the water is moving up. Blue coloration shows the water moving down. And so Ellie and Beth and I are currently looking at whether and how these vibrations might operate as signals. So beyond communication, water striders have been really important animals for the study of sexual conflict. And one reason for that is that we can point to characters in males and females that have evolved to mediate conflict between the sexes. So in males, we've got the presence of grasping traits that are used for holding onto females that are struggling to get away. And so that includes this pregenital segment of the abdomen. It houses the grasping genitalia that are deployed when trying to mate with a female. So that those genitals have to wrap around this spine that females have to reach the genital opening. Females have this spine that functions to help females resist male mating attempts. And we have evidence for co-evolution between these traits. So this figure is from some past work we did where each point here is a population. You have male traits on the x-axis, female traits on the y. And so what we see is that those populations where females have bigger spines, those are the same populations where males have a larger pregenital segments. And so that's consistent with this idea of covariation, coevolution between the sexes. So there's actually only a small handful of organisms where we can connect sexual conflict to a pattern of covariation like this. Okay, so we've got some evidence consistent with a sexual arms race, but what we didn't know is whether and how that arms race might be shaped by the local environment. And there's two long-standing big ideas about how ecology might influence sexual conflict and sexual arms races. And the first is that a sexual arms race could happen even independently of any environmental variation. So if you imagine, say, a mutation that made female spines bigger in one population, that would create selection on males to evolve more exaggerated grasping traits, which would in turn feed back selection on female spines. And so you could get coevolution happening just based on mutation order effects between the sexes, even independently from environmental variation. But the second idea is that the ecological setting should influence how sexual conflict happens and how coevolution proceeds. And so to be more specific about that, we should expect environmental variation that influences the costs of expressing and investing in sexual traits. We should expect those things to be important. So variables that are about growth, for example, so things like food should be important. And then we should also expect environmental variation that affects the mating interaction between the sexes. Those kinds of variables should be important as well. Okay, so we wanted to look at how ecology influenced conflict in water striders. So to do that, we sampled 18 populations of species along a transect along the coast of British Columbia and into the interior a little bit. So covering about 500 kilometers there. So we have these populations. We know that the populations are genetically differentiated to a greater or lesser extent from each other. So we developed microsatellites for the species, used them to calculate genetic distance. So in this figure, each point is a pairwise comparison between two populations. And so what we see here is that populations that are more geographically distant from each other are also more genetically differentiated, but also with lots of evidence for intergression among the populations. So here's what some of the sites look like. So we can see there's lots of variation in environmental properties across these sites. So they're sampled about the same time of year, So we can see there's huge variation in the length of the growing season, the breeding season. Some sites have open water, other sites are very densely vegetated. So that affects things like presence of refugia from predators. And then sites also vary in what kinds of predators are about and their abundance. And that's really important because predation affects the costs of mating. So here we have a female, a male water strider on top, they're mating. And female is closest to the surface of the water. And that is a problem for her because mating activity attracts the attention of predators like this backswimmer, who come along and are often able to nab the female and devour her, and the male is free to skate away and harass other females. So that's a beautiful video shot by water strider biologist Chang Han. Okay, so there's lots of ecological variation. Does it translate into an influence on diversification in sexual traits, coevolution between the sexes? So we identified 12 ecological variables that are known to influence something about growth or mating interactions in water striders. So for example, things that influence food availability, like canopy cover. So we did model selection to identify variables that are associated with divergence across populations. And after that model selection, we found that several variables had explanatory power for variation or divergence in sexual traits across populations. So that's what we are seeing here. Each point is a population, a mean female spine length for that population. And so what we can see is that it's warmer sites with longer breeding seasons and with less acidic water. Those sites tend to have females with smaller spines. So this raises the hypothesis that these kind of abiotically benign habitats mean weaker selection on females for the expression of a sexual armament like a spine. So overall, we can pick up this signature of ecological variation associated with this sexual trait. And in fact, ecological variation can explain variation in sexual traits better than some alternative models. So here in this figure, the degree of model support, strongest support is for lower values here. So over on the right, we have the degree of support for the ecological model. You can see it's doing better than a null model, just a baseline model. It also has stronger support than a model of trait divergence just through spatial structure of the populations or through neutral genetic divergence based on population-specific FST. So that ecological model has better explanatory power than some alternatives. Okay, so what that's telling us is that the local environment can explain the degree of exaggeration in these sexual traits, where populations end up along this major axis of variation. But can ecology also tell us who will be ahead in the sexual arms race? And so in water striders, we can identify who's got a leg up, so to speak, because populations above the line here are those populations where females have a relatively big spine, given the males in their population. So they have an advantage. Populations below the line are where males have an advantage relative to females. So does ecological variation explain where populations are ending up in that dimension of this coevolutionary space? And the answer is that yes, it can. So here it's populations where there's a milder temperature regime, where males have an advantage in the sexual arms race. So this is the degree of male advantage on the y-axis here. Males have more of an advantage in locations where the longer breeding season, less severe winter, less snow, temperatures that are less often very cold. So one hypothesis might explain this pattern is that in a harsher environment, it pays females more to invest in spines to reduce costly matings more than it pays males to keep up with those females. So putting this together, what these data tell us is that we can predict where populations will end up in this coevolutionary space based on properties of the local environment. When these insects live in warmer sites, longer breeding seasons, both sexes evolve reduced traits. And in an abiotically tougher location that's colder, the shorter breeding season, females have larger spines and tend to have a relative advantage over males. So we have this signature of ecology on sexual conflict. So in the last couple minutes, I'll finish off by telling you about some work building on this work to take this even further. So we have recent discovery grant funding to ask more questions about sexual arms races. And the next things that we'll be looking at are these. So, what I've been telling you about the sexual arms race in water striders so far, that's all based on one species of water strider sampled in one location. So we don't have any idea about whether that's a weird thing that happened in that species one time, or is there good repeatability? Do we have a general ability to predict the outcome of a sexual arms race based on the environment? And so to get at that question, we're undertaking population work in another region in the Maritimes and establishing long-term sites to look at the temporal dynamics over time. Also exploring these patterns in other species beyond the one that I've focused on today. Another direction is that, we have so far found this ecological variation associated with divergence in sexual traits. But if we really understand what is happening, we should be able to manipulate the environment and push populations around in coevolutionary space. And so we have experimental evolution work coming up to do just that. And finally, we have a good understanding of these phenotypes in water striders that mediate conflict, but know very little about the genes that contribute to those traits. And so that is a big outstanding question in the field, the genes that contribute to sexual armaments. Because if we could identify those genes, then we could explore how sexual conflict is shaping the genetic architecture of those traits. And we could ask about coevolution at the genetic level, genetic change in male and female expressed loci in response to each other. So truly test ideas about coevolution. Skip that slide in order to just conclude to say that the message that I want to leave you with today is that there's this strong connection between evolutionary conflict and especially sexual conflict and the local environment. We can pick that up on different levels, the level of plasticity, microevolution, macroevolution. And that kind of conflict can drive really rapid evolutionary change, rapid enough that we can see it in an experimental evolution study, in population level divergence. So we're exploring this contemporary evolutionary process. Okay, so that brings me to the end of the talk. I just want to thank you all once again for being here for this talk today. And just to say again that any students who are interested in having a chat about a project, I definitely encourage you to get in touch. That would be great.